Useless loser becomes a skeleton but starts evolving into a high-rank monster. Rent is an ugly, pathetic, disgusting loser adventurer from a small town who dreams about becoming a mithril-class adventurer. Yet, despite working for 10 years, Rent has been a dumb bronze-class adventurer for eternity. He usually wakes up early just like me and all poor people who need to work. Yet, despite having a dream job, all he can do are basic missions. This is because the Adventurer Guild puts ranks on their missions to avoid unnecessary deaths. While checking the current missions, Rent realizes they're all pretty much trash. Therefore, he decides to explore the labyrinth. However, despite the labyrinth being deserted because everyone already cleared it, Rent is surprised when he sees a secret passageway. He gets hyped, thinking he can report this discovery to the guild and become rich. However, this pathetic excuse of a human decides to explore it, hoping to find treasures. He manages to enter a room where he sees a huge dragon. He thinks this is the greatest type of monster, and according to the legends, they have several forms, and this one follows the Rock's workout program. The dragon starts to approach him, and Rent cannot move, otherwise he will wet himself. In the end, this huge dragon with 2 mouths takes a huge bite on his breakfast. However, hours later Rent manages to get up, surprised to be alive. However, when he looks at his reflection, he notices that he has become an uglier skeleton. After the shock, he wonders if he's truly alive until he realizes that he has become an undead monster. He thinks about returning to the town because he still has his human memories. However, if a bishop or a priest finds him, they will destroy him with their magic. He realizes the dragon is missing and decides to get out of the room to avoid a potential double kill. As he walks, Rent explains that nobody knows where the labyrinths come from or how they work. They only know there are many around the world with treasures inside. Rent thinks about waiting for a new adventurer to come to this labyrinth and ask for help. However, he's just a pile of bones who cannot talk. Suddenly, another skeleton appears and confronts Rent. Rent wants to defeat it with his sword, but recognizes that it's hard to move his body without any muscles. He raises his sword to strike this skeleton, but he ends up falling behind. Yet, the other skeleton also suffers from calcium deficit as it trips after losing its leg bone. Rent realizes that it's going to be hard to deal with a monster without sword techniques or muscles. He then suddenly finds out that he can still use spirit energy to buff up his physical attributes despite not being human. With this buff, he manages to destroy the skull and sees the bone pile glow with some pixie powder. He finds out that he just recovered the spirit energy he used and remembers his talk with his friend Lorraine. She is a researcher who told him that monsters could evolve into other species. At that time, she mentioned that skeletons could sometimes evolve into ghouls, calling it existential evolution. After this memory, Rent thinks that if he can evolve into a ghoul, he can get some flesh back. He then could use some clothes to cover himself and return to the town without any problems. Therefore, Rent decides to start defeating monsters in this labyrinth for a chance to evolve. He quickly manages to defeat 5 skeletons and manages to get some of his mobility back. Every time he defeats an enemy, he gets healed, and that allows him to use his spirit energy in every battle. While looking for more monsters, he finds a slime. Despite being a weak monster, there are only 2 ways to defeat it: to pierce its core or beat it up until it cannot regenerate. Rent manages to dodge the slime's attack and counters. However, he didn't expect to hit the core on his first try. He decides to keep the magic stone and collects the slime fluid to sell it later on, as it's used in cosmetics. Over time, Rent notices that as an undead, he doesn't need to sleep or eat, which helps him to focus on fighting to achieve his evolution. However, that seems to be taking a long time. Still, he managed to get his physical abilities back and could use mana and divine power again despite being undead. Yet he feels down because he spent 10 years as a weak adventurer and now is dead. He's one of the rare adventurers who can use spirit energy, mana, and divine power, but since he's trash, they're all basic. He wished he could be strong and achieve his goal of becoming mithril class, which is the highest adventurer class. Yet, he decides that being a skeleton won't stop him from reaching his dream. He starts taking out more monsters and realizes he's getting stronger than when he was a human. After defeating another slime, Rent notices the power seems quite different. Suddenly, his body starts to change, creating muscles, hair, skin, and even eyes. He realizes he managed to evolve into a ghoul, and he can now make sounds with his mouth. He feels happy that he finally has some flesh hugging his bones despite it being pretty dry. However, this makes him realize that if he keeps working hard, he might be able to become a high-rank undead like a vampire. He first decides to speak some words, but all that comes out is a roar. With some training, he manages to say hello and good morning. However, he still needs to practice to sound less like a zombie. Since Rent evolved into a ghoul, he can now strengthen his sword as well. He hears the clang of swords in the distance and checks it out. It's a girl fighting off skeleton monsters, but she looks exhausted. She finally defeats it. She proceeds deeper into the dungeon and Rent watches her. He doesn't recognize her, so he thinks she must be a rookie. She goes down a corridor and a skeleton monster forms behind her. She engages it in combat and Rent notices that she has good form, but she's weak. The skeleton monster grips her sword and pushes her against the wall. Rent has no choice but to step in. He comes out screaming to get the skeleton's attention, and the skeleton faces him. Rent was hoping the girl would attack the skeleton from behind, but she was too stunned to do so. The skeleton tries to attack him, but Rent takes it down. He tries to talk to her, but she's horrified by his appearance. He tries to introduce himself, but she tells him to stay away from her. He throws his sword down and raises his arms to assure her. She notices he's not a mere ghoul, and Rent tells her he's an adventurer. He tells her he actually passed away, but he's still somehow alive. She thanks him for saving her life, and he tells her he had to because adventurers look out for each other. She still doesn't trust him, so she asks him not to take her life away. He assures her that he won't do that, but he needs her to help him get some clothes. He tells her that he wants to go back to the city, and she tells him she could get him a robe that hides his body. He puts a bag of coins on the ground and tells her to keep the change. She moves forward to pick up the bag and introduces herself as Rena. He leads her back to the entrance of the dungeon, and she tells him she will be back for him. Typically, a proper adventurer would report the sight of a ghoul to the guild for immediate action, but he doesn't think she'll betray him. Rena goes back to the city and meets up with Sheila, the Adventurers Guild receptionist. Rena tells her a lot has happened, and she has an urgent question for her. Meanwhile, Rent is engaged in combat with a glob monster. The monster throws some globs at Rent, but he dodges it. He notices he's not just stronger, but his body also moves just as he wants it to. He strikes at the moving core of the monster and destroys it easily. Rent thinks that his combat intuition got better after becoming a ghoul. Suddenly, he hears Rena's voice calling his name. As he approaches him, she pulls out her sword and takes a few steps back, asking him if he's Rent or a random ghoul. He tells her he's Rent, and she eases up, saying he has gotten better at talking. He tells her he practiced while she was away. She shows him the robe and backs up. Rent looks at her, and she apologizes, telling him she's still a bit scared. She tells him she needs more time to get used to him, and he tells her it's fine for her to feel like that. He picks up the robe and tells Rena it's perfect. She tells him she also bought other things she thought he might need. A pair of gloves, shoes, and some bandages. She tells him she bought those to hide his arms and legs from sight. Rent thinks Rena is very kind and tires them on. It's much easier for Rent to move in the clothes than he thought it would be, though the hood makes him lose some visibility. She holds up a mirror for him, but he still thinks he stands out too much. Rena brings out a mask, mentioning that she was prepared for it. The mask attaches itself magically to his face. Rena tells him he looks great, but he tries to get the mask off, and it doesn't come off. He tells her he can't get it off, and she apologizes. She tells him it was shockingly cheap, and Rent figures out that it's cursed. He tries to dispel it with his divinity, but he runs out of energy. Rena apologizes for bringing him a cursed item, but he tells her it's fine since he has to hide his face anyway. He tells her he just has to hire a cleric to break the curse. Rent walks up to her, trying to reassure her by patting her shoulder, but he thinks he may be too intrusive and back up. She grabs his hand and tells him he's a good person, and she's not scared of him anymore. She tells him they can now head back to the city, and they leave the dungeon. They arrive at the city, but Rent is reluctant to follow Rena because a lot of people in the city know him. They'll know something is wrong if he shows them his ID at the gate. She asks him if they can go through another gate, and he tells her there's one that's not frequently used. She tells him they better head for that gate. The guards allow Rent to pass, and Rent thanks Rena. Rena is distracted by a carriage, and Rent uses that opportunity to disappear. Rena begins looking for him, but he hides on the roof. Rent doesn't want to ruin her guild life, so he decides to stay away from her. Later at night, Rent goes to a house in search of someone who can help him. Since he couldn't work with Rena, he had to find someone who could keep secrets. It knocks on the door, but no one answers, so he lets himself in. He sees Lorraine sleeping on the couch and tries to wake her up. She tells him to let her sleep more, but he threatens to drop a book on her head. She sits up and is shocked by his weird appearance. She thinks it's just a mask, but he takes off his glove to show her his ghoul hand. Lorraine is contemplating putting up a search request at the Adventurer Guild. Suddenly, she hears a familiar knock on the door, and she knows it's Rent. But Rent doesn't enter immediately, so she knows something must have happened to him, but she's glad he's alive. She lies down on the couch and pretends to be asleep. Rent opens the door, and he comes over to the couch to wake her up. She tells him to allow her to sleep some more, but he threatens to wake her up in a brutal way. She finally opens her eyes to look at Rent, and she realizes he's now a ghoul. Rent tells her the story of what happened to him, but Lorraine doesn't believe him. She has been researching monsters and magic, and she had never come across a scenario where someone was turned into an undead after being eaten by a dragon. She asks him if the dragon is still in the labyrinth, and he tells her the dragon is probably already gone. Lorraine has no choice but to believe his story because of how he now looks. Rent is surprised by how calm Lorraine is after seeing his body up close, but he feels like she'll treat him as a research subject rather than a friend. Lorraine paces for a while thinking, and suddenly, she asks Rent if he still remembers his identity now that he's undead. Rent tells her he still has the memories and consciousness of himself before he became an undead. But that doesn't change the fact that he's lost his life once. He tells her he's not very sure he's still the same person, and she tells him that's exactly how the Rent she knows would reply. Though it's still hard to confirm he's the same person, she tells him they'll worry about that later. She asks him what he plans to do with his life, and he tells her he wants to continue living as an adventurer. He aims to achieve the highest rank in the guild, but he knows he can't go to the guild looking like an undead. Lorraine figures out that he needs her to take up quests for him, and he'll have to crash at her place for a while. She asks him if that's okay with him, and he tells her he's fine with that. But she asks for his help with her research. She doesn't want to miss the opportunity to examine a subject that underwent an existential evolution. Rent tells her he's fine with it as long as she doesn't dissect him. She tells him she's not Frankenstein, but she'll need a little bit of skin once in a while. The next day, Rent is doing some chores when Lorraine comes back to the house. She tells him she went to the guild, and she gives him the payment for the slime liquids and magic crystals he got from the labyrinth. Rent thinks he was overpaid for the resources, but she tells him they were of good quality and the guild will put them to good use. He takes the payment and tells her he will be going to see an infamous blacksmith. Later in the day, Rent walks through the market district, happy his wallet is so full. As he walks along the street, he draws the gaze of other people who are shopping. He notices their gaze fixed on him, and he tries to hide his face better. He finally arrives at the blacksmith shop, and he's welcomed by the receptionist. She notices his outfit, and she's a bit surprised. Rent apologizes for his suspicious look. She asks him what he wants, and he drops his sword on the counter and tells her he needs a new one. She unsheathes the sword and looks at its edges. She notices the sword was treated well, but it has been overused. She asks him if he uses magic or spirit energy, and he tells her he uses mana, spirit, and divinity magic. She is surprised he is thrice blessed because they are very rare. She tells him there's only one other customer who is thrice blessed, and Rent asks her to keep his a secret. He presents her with a bag of coins, asking if it would be sufficient. She tells him it'll suffice, but he only has to pay half first, then pay the balance after the sword is ready. But she warns him that her husband is a perfectionist, and he would need several days to make the sword. She also tells him her husband may call him several times to get his opinions on how he wants his sword to look. He tells her he doesn't mind, and that they can reach him if they contact Lorraine's place. Meanwhile, Lorraine is at home reading a book about ghouls. She finds out their preferred meals and how they are formed. She also finds out that ghouls which are turned by other powerful monsters tend to lose their memories and human emotions. She closes the book as she now knows that Rent's case is very special. She's still not sure he is the same person he was before he was turned, but he still feels like the same Rent she has always known. She remembered when she was younger, and she took a quest at the guild. A man stopped her and found out her quest would be taking her to a forest far away from the city. He offers up young Rent to be her pack-bearer for free so he can gain some experience since he was still a rookie. They arrive at the forest, and Lorraine is in search of a particular herb, but she can't find it. She wonders if her quest description texts were wrong. Back then, the world was boring to Lorraine, and though she was the youngest to attain the title of Great Doctor, it didn't mean much to her. but the title allowed her to register as a silver rank adventurer. After getting the title, she quickly left for the city of Yorlin to gather some herbs since she had nothing better to do. She finally found the herb she was looking for, and she harvested it carefully to preserve its usefulness. She packed it up and told young Rent to put it in her pack. He takes the pack to her, and she's surprised to find it almost full with the same herbs she had been struggling to find. She asks him how he was able to find the herb and harvest it correctly, but Rent is distracted by something in the forest. She glances at the direction he's looking at to see a goblin notching an arrow into its bow. Young Rent raises his shield to defend her, and he tells her to use a spell against the goblin. She uses the spell to completely obliterate the goblin. Young Rent praises her magic level, but she tells him it's nothing special. After the battle, he offers her some water, asking if that was her first battle. She tells him it was not, but her escorts aren't usually as experienced. She realizes that young Rent is more than a pack-bearer. He tells her the other adventurers were worried she didn't have enough experience for her rank, so they told him to follow her. She asked him how he knew so much about herbs. He told her someone advised him to read about everything he could find concerning herbs and monsters if he wanted to become a good adventurer. This was when they first introduced themselves to each other, and they became friends. Lorraine asks him to teach her all he knows about herbs and how to fight. She noticed he knew exactly how to move through the forest, and she asked him for the trick behind it. He promised to teach her everything, and he worked hard for 10 years since they'd known each other, trying to achieve the highest adventure rank. Lorraine stayed by his side doing the research she had loved all this time. She now sees why the elders were worried about her years ago. She realizes she hasn't been replying to her letter because didn't want some old men to lecture her. She gets up from her chair, wondering where she kept her unread letters. Rent meets with the blacksmith, and he thanks him for making him a new sword. The blacksmith promises to make him something special, and they shake on it. His wife presents Rent with a temporary sword to use before his own is ready. The sword can only use mana and spirit energy. He takes the sword and leaves. The blacksmith tells his wife Rent may be in some trouble, and she wonders why he didn't ask for their help. The husband tells her he's probably suffering from a curse, and he doesn't want it to affect their shop. He figured out that Rent didn't want to cause trouble for other people. He asks his wife for the information Rent shared with her, and she tells him. He tells her they may get him to talk about his curse one day, since he will be frequenting their shop. Rent returns home, and he makes dinner for him and Lorraine. Lorraine enjoys his cooking, and he tells her she can't have seconds if she wants. She notices he hasn't touched his dinner, and he tells her he doesn't get hungry. She takes that as a good sign. She tells him she was studying about ghouls while he was away, and she tells him he's different from an average ghoul. That's the reason he can evolve, and she asks him what he will become next. He tells her he just wants to be as human as possible, so he'll just aim for his next existential evolution. Lorraine figures out he has to return to the labyrinth, and he tells her he has to destroy monsters to evolve faster. The next day, an adventurer is fighting a slime monster in the labyrinth, but he's no match for it. He's about to be completely overwhelmed by the monster, but it suddenly melts away. Rent saves the man, and the man thanks him. He tells Rent he didn't expect the slime to attack like that, and though he got a little cut, he'll be fine. Rent begins to walk away since adventurers are expected to take care of themselves. The man tries to stop Rent, but Rent doesn't listen to him. Rent had heard of people who pretend to be in a sticky situation and then rob those who help them. The man runs in front of Rent and asks to join his party. He tells him he needs the money because he just registered as an adventurer and can't even fight a slime. Rent tells him slimes are strong, and they always give swordsmen a tough time. The man tells Rent he's a chef and he has a restaurant. He's in a huge debt that he needs to repay by the next week. He told every adventurer he met he'll do anything they ask as long as they let him join their party, but no one gave him a chance. He decided to explore the labyrinth by himself, but only strong people can do that and get away with it. Rent tells him he's too busy, and the man watches him walk away. Rent would have loved to let the man join him, but he didn't see him with any useful magic items. He suddenly has an idea, and he tells the man he can tag along as long as he's okay with carrying a pack. The man suddenly rushes to follow Rent, happy to finally join a party. Rent doesn't know if the guy is a good or a bad guy, but he figures it can't hurt to help someone. The man tells Rent he will do whatever he commands. They keep walking through the labyrinth, and they get to a part that the man thinks is a dead end, but Rent tells him to trust him. The man is surprised to see a corridor that the map says is a dead end. They walk through the corridor and arrive at an opening, and the man is surprised such a place exists in the labyrinth. Rent is even more surprised that there's no dragon in sight. They explore the opening and Rent is disappointed. He didn't find any magic items. The man calls out to Rent, telling him he found a little gap on the walls. They look through the gap to find a hidden corridor. The man tells Rent they can make a fortune if they tell the guild about the secret passage. He tells Rent he'll tell everyone it was Rent who found it, but Rent tells him he's not interested in glory and the man can take the credit for finding it. Rent enters the passage and asks the man to follow him. They find an empty room and the man enters it. He tells Rent they can look for another secret passage or a hidden treasure since no one had ever come to that section before. Rent tells him to wait, but he doesn't hear Rent over his babbling. Rent enters the room and a teleportation circle activates at the center of the room. He tries to warn the man, but the man tells him not to worry because there are no monsters in sight. Rent realizes the man can't see the circle, and he tries to stop him, but he steps on it and he's teleported away. Rent knows the teleportation circle leads to a room filled with monsters or traps, and he considers leaving the man to his fate. But he doesn't want to be more of a monster than he already is. He steps on the circle, which teleports him to a dark room. He sees the man on the floor, and he tries to help him, but he hears the feet of a monster stomp on the ground. A giant skeleton appears from the shadows, and Rent realizes the skeleton is an area boss. Rent has no choice but to face the huge undead skeleton. He tries a spirit attack on it, but it's ineffective. The skeleton tries to strike back, but Rent dodges away. He decides to try a mana attack, but it's also ineffective against the skeleton. The skeleton tries to counterattack, but Rent gets out of the way. Now Rent is getting desperate. He looks for an escape route, but the entrance is sealed. Since he's in a boss room, he'll have to defeat the skeleton before he can get out. Rent curses his bad luck as the skeleton starts approaching him. Rent remembers the adventurer's code never to give up regardless of the situation. Though Rent is not sure his sword can handle it, he decides to use his divinity skill. He attacks the skeleton with the skill, and he takes out its leg. The skeleton loses its balance and falls to the ground, and Rent uses that opportunity to run up its spine and land a final blow on the skeleton's skull. He tends to his follower's wounds, and the man wakes up. He remembers there was a huge skeleton before he passed out, and he almost panics. Rent tells him he can only do basic first aid and can't heal his wounds fully. The man looks around and sees the remains of the skeleton. He asks Rent if he defeated the skeleton alone, and Rent shows him the huge magical crystal the skeleton dropped. The man figured out that the monster was very tough for it to drop such a huge crystal. He commends Rent for being skillful enough to defeat the monster solo. Rent tells him it was just luck, and he tells the man he'll hand him the crystal if he wants. His follower can't believe his ears, but Rent tells him it'll come at a price. His follower asks Rent what he wants in return because he feels he can't be of much use to Rent after seeing how strong an adventurer he is. Rent shows the man he's now a ghoul after being attacked by the dragon in the past. He tells the man he can't enter the shops in the guild because of that, so he'll need him to do that in his stead. The man agrees to it, but he feels the deal is too good to be true because he's getting so much out of it for so little. Rent decided to add one more thing to the deal. He asks the man to give him free meals at his restaurant anytime he wants. The man is brought to tears by this request, and he tells Rent he can eat as much as he wants anytime he wants. He promises to work hard to make sure he doesn't go bankrupt. He thanks Rent for the opportunity, and Rent hands him the crystal, telling him it's time to go home. The man asks Rent how they'll get out of the labyrinth, and Rent points him in a direction. The man tells Rent he can't see anything, and Rent is surprised the man can't see the room. Rent tells his follower that they can return to their former location if they go towards that direction, and he believes Rent. He moves towards it, and he's teleported back. Rent looks back to see another room leading to another room, and he decides to come back later to explore it. They return to the city, and Rent's disciple takes him to his restaurant named the Red Dragon Pavilion. The places looked better than Rent envisioned. Suddenly, the man's wife rushes out and hugs him, glad to see him alive and well. She notices his wounds, and she tells him he needs to go see a doctor ASAP. He tells Isabel, his wife, that Rent healed him after he was hurt. Isabel didn't notice Rent before, and she apologizes for being oblivious. Her husband tells her Rent saved his life, and he shows her the crystal Rent gave him. Isabel tells him he can't take the crystal, wondering if he hasn't learned his lesson from his past. She tells him they won't be able to foot their bill if they get scammed again. He reassures her that Rent is too kind a person to pull a scam on them. He recounts how he told Rent about their debt and he offered to help. He tells her Rent isn't doing it for free and he'll be offering his services to Rent in compensation. She asks him if he'll be doing anything dangerous and he tells her it'll just be simple errands. He tells her he promised Rent free meals at their restaurant and she wonders if all that's enough to make the deal even. He tells her it was enough to make the deal and he apologizes for worrying her. The man figures out that Rent is yet to know his name, and he introduces himself as Loris. They both thank him for helping them, and Rent bids them goodbye. He turns and starts walking away, but Loris doesn't want him to go without telling him his name. Rent turns back and asks him to promise not to tell anyone. Loris promises to keep it a secret and to only call him boss. Rent tells Loris his name and Loris tells him they'll always give him a warm welcome at their restaurant. Rent is on his way home, and he thinks it was unfortunate that Loris wasn't a liar and a crook. His vision starts turning red as he thinks it would have been better for him that way. He was hoping to try out something sinister on some bad guys. He arrives at their cottage, and his vision gets even more static. He wonders what he's thinking as he falls to his knees and calls Lorraine's name in a sinister voice. He walks into the house with his vision completely covered in red. Lorraine asks him if he encountered the dragon at the labyrinth, and he tells her he didn't. She asks him where he kept the letters from the capital so she can reply to whoever wrote to her. Rent answers her, but she notices he sounds different. She asks him if anything happened to him, and he tells her he's in a good mood. Lorraine is about to ask if something good happened to him, but he just hugs her out of the blue. She wonders if he's drunk, but then she remembers an undead cannot get drunk. Lorraine is enjoying the moment when suddenly Rent bares his teeth and sinks them into her neck. She pushes him off her, wondering if the real Rent is still somewhere inside his body. Rent is surprised by how delicious her juice is, but she calls his name and he regains himself. She uses her magic to knock him down and put him to sleep. She tells him she doesn't mind him eating her as long as he does it when he's sober. Rent wakes up later at night with a splitting headache. He remembers being in the labyrinth with Loris. Lorraine asks him if he feels controlled by any creature or some unnatural impulse. He tells her he's not being controlled and Lorraine is relieved. He apologizes to Lorraine, but Lorraine sums it up as an unfortunate accident. Rent tries to tell her it's more than that, but she stops him from talking. She asks him how much he remembers before he blacked out, and he tells her he remembers attacking her. He tells her he remembers meeting a man at the labyrinth, and then he talked about an appetizing meal. That was when he lost control, and once he saw Lorraine, he thought she was too delicious to pass up. She tells him it's right for a ghoul to crave a human. She asks him if he remained unhurt after she hit him with her magic, and he tells her he's all right. She tells him to get some rest, and she tells him she'll also get some rest. She's walking to her room, but he tells her he wants to see where he hurt her. She draws back her cloth to reveal the bite mark. She tells him she's out healing potions, but she'll make one the following day. Rent heals the wound, and she's surprised to see he can use his divinity skill to that extent. He tells her he can heal minor injuries, and she tells him the healing sensation is very pleasant. Rent finishes healing her, and she takes off the bandage. Rent can still see some bite marks, and he decides to heal her even more. Lorraine notices he's looking different. He takes off his clothes to look at himself, and she tells him he can tell people the scars on his body are from old battles. He looks at his face in the mirror, and he's surprised to see his mask has also changed. The lower half of his face is showing, and Rent tells Lorraine that part should remain hidden. The mask responds by hiding the power part of his face and showing just the upper part of his face. Lorraine wonders if the mask is reacting to his will, and Rent changes the mask to show his lower face. Lorraine asks him if he can remove the mask now that it follows his will. Rent tries removing it, but it remains stuck. Lorraine also tries pulling it off his face, but it doesn't budge. She's confused by this, but since he still looks like an undead, she figures it's best the mask stays on. The mask changes back to cover his lower face, and Rent tells her he would leave it like that for the time being. Lorraine also notices that Rent's voice is much clearer now, and he wonders if he went through an existential evolution. He's confused about why his evolution was delayed, because the last time he evolved was right after he defeated a monster. Lorraine wonders if his evolution was caused by the consumption of her flesh and blood. She tells him the idea isn't so far-fetched, because he now looks more like a thrall than a ghoul. Thralls are monsters who are servants of vampires. They're ranked lower than vampires, and Lorraine tells Rent he looks very similar to one. Rent wonders why he would evolve into a thrall, and Lorraine tells him the concept of existential evolution is still a mystery to scholars. She tells him she has a hypothesis and tells him not to fall asleep while she explains it to him. She follows his evolution from a skeleton to a ghoul and asks him if it wasn't a weird change. Rent is lost, and she explains that existential evolution involves a monster turning into a higher rank of itself. She wonders if the ghoul is the only higher-ranking version of a skeleton. Rent tells her there are skeleton knights and skeleton soldiers, which are higher versions of the skeleton. Lorraine tells him that there have been stories of skeletons changing to ghouls, but nobody knows if it was by chance or for a certain reason. She tells him her theory is he wanted to become a particular monster, and he was thinking in that direction during his evolution. Rent realized that he wanted to become something more human, like during his latest transformation. He wonders why he turned into a ghoul instead of a vampire, which looks closer to a human. Lorraine tells him it could be similar to the guild system rank, and he has to meet certain criteria to evolve. Lorraine explains that when they carried out experiments on lesser animals, it was determined that their evolution was determined by their environment. She tells him it may not have been the environment of the creatures, but the creatures themselves that caused their evolution. She tells him that may be the ability he has. He understands that if he tries hard enough, he can become a vampire and eventually become a human again. She tells him she's not sure he can become a human again. She tells him he may need to do more than slay monsters to achieve his next existential evolution. He understands that he would need to meet many more conditions to become a vampire. He tells Lorraine there is a lot they don't know about his evolution, and she tells him their discussion was just a hypothesis because they're not even sure of all they said. She tells him the best bet is to take things step by step, and she offers to help him through his journey. He thanks her for offering her help. She tells him it's time for him to become a lab rat, and she tells him to take off his clothes. She tells him all she'll do to him to find out all she needs to know about him. Rent is horrified by the thought of it all, but she tells him they'll start the experiment the following day. Rent is surprised by this, and Lorraine tells him it's common sense to know he's already tired. The next day, Lorraine is still sleeping, but Rent is already outside swinging his sword to find out how his body feels. He's convinced he feels fine, but he looks at his sword to see its edge jagged. He can't go into the labyrinth with such a sword, and he knows Clope would be upset when he takes it to him. He takes it to Clope, and Clope tells him the sword is irreparable. Rent apologizes for infusing the sword with divinity. Clope now understands why the sword was so battered. He tells Rent there shouldn't be any monsters nearby that require divinity to be defeated, and Rent tells him he encountered a giant skeleton in an uncharted territory. Clope can't believe his ears, and now he understands why Rent has such a weird equipment set. He asks Rent if he fully explored the territory, and Rent tells him he's yet to do that. He asks Clope if he can finish his sword as soon as possible. Clope was already expecting his request, and he tells Rent his sword is not even close to being finished. He gives him a replacement for his battered sword, but this one is slightly better. Rent leaves the shop, happy he got a replacement. As Rent is walking down the street, he spots Isabel and Loris buying foodstuff to prepare meals at their restaurant. Loris announces to everyone that the Red Dragon Pavilion would be reopening that day. Rent is happy to hear this, and he walks away silently.